Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. Welcome to another edition of Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is the lovely Nora St. John. How you doing, Nora?
Very well, thank you. It's a lovely day out here in sunny California.
It is wonderful. It's going to get up to mid-90s here in DC, which can get a little sweltering. So I'm happy to be inside in the air conditioning today. Happy to be a little tempered. It'll be all right. It'll be a little warm when I leave in a few hours, but that's okay. It's summertime. It's going to happen. It's going to get warm again.
No, we haven't even really hit the temperature we usually hit here. It's been a very, very cool spring. So that's been really nice. It's a beautiful weekend. There's a little bit of a breeze. It's in the mid 80s, low to mid 80s. So I'm sure that will change soon, but I'm enjoying it for the moment.
Yeah, it's going to. It is going to. It'll be painful. At least here in DC, it gets so sweltering. Although in Sacramento, my gosh, I mean, I was there and it was like 117 degrees. And just, it can be pretty stifling.
Yeah. It's dry heat, but it's still really hot.
So is an oven. So yes, it's still a little warm. Speaking of pain, today I want to cover something that you and I have talked about off and on for years and years. And when you were developing your latest program, the Advanced Movement Principles, you did a deep dive into it, and it's something that I've wanted to sort of poke your brain on, and that's the new pain science. Pain science is something that I don't even think was even called that for a number of years because people didn't really understand what really happens when we talk about, pain and what the body goes through. And for us, more in the healing arts, where we're working with clients with pain, what should we do? What's the traditional remedies? And everything. I thought, you know what? This is a really good opportunity to do a dive into this and talk about what the newer, thought process is and sort of go from there and see what rabbit holes we can dive down today.
Perfect. So I originally developed a lot of this work with a gal, Lindy Royer, who's a physical therapist from Denver, Colorado. And we put it together for a video course as part of the Advanced Movement Principles. And honestly, the new material, the new information, the new science is coming out about pain, dealing with pain, working with pain, how the pain works in the brain is just fascinating. And for better and worse, goes almost entirely against our intuitive kind of natural understanding of what pain is and how it works.
Yeah.
And that's what gets a little confusing about it when you first start to learn about this. It's like, what? What? And there's also a lot of ways in which modern pain science can be very misinterpreted because when you look at the science from one direction, you can say, oh, it's just all in your mind, which we'll get to in a moment. Well, yes, it's all in your brain, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have conscious control over a lot of the elements of it. So let's start back at the beginning.
Okay.
There are a couple of really fantastic and well-known pain researchers that are doing a lot of amazing work on this. Lorimer Moseley and his whole gang in Australia have been doing a lot of work on this. He's got some fabulous books about it, which you can put, in the series notes here. But it started out with just what is pain? And when you ask somebody what pain is, it's like, it's an uncomfortable physical, emotional sensation, right? Okay, something like that. And when you're dealing with somebody with pain, so if you've got a client with pain, which you and I both have had a lot of in our careers, there are some very interesting elements of that I think are important for us to think about. So one of the things is that, and this is where things get radical right away, that the amount of tissue damage has no relationship to the amount of pain a client is in. Okay, so just starting with that. We often think about, I cut myself, it hurts. A equals B. Actually, no, that's not how it is at all. And one of the examples that has come up a lot is, for example, there's a famous story of a rock climber who fell from his perch, right? He was on the rock, fell down, and his arm got stuck in something, and he had to basically, the only way for him to get out of the situation he was in safely was to cut off his own arm. Pretty radical, admittedly,
A
very
little bit.
radical. Yeah. And basically, he could do that and not experience a huge amount of pain in the process. And the reason I say that way is because the pain was contextual.
What do you mean
So
by that?
because so because he was in a situation where it was either like stay alive, and cut off my arm or die, the body goes, okay, what's my priority? My priority is you have to cut off your arm. Therefore, we're not going to really think about the pain process in cutting off your own arm.
Okay.
Okay, sort of a radical concept there. Or things like, oftentimes the most painful thing in the body is something very light. Like if you have a blister on your heel that bursts, that'll hurt a lot. It can hurt a lot more than a deep puncture wound. So there's a way in which again, pain is contextual. It's also not directly related to tissue damage. And that's the first level of just understanding pain science. This comes up a lot in doing a lot of the research for the advanced movement principles and looking at MRI research, MRI evidence, or X-ray evidence of different conditions like osteoarthritis or lumbar disc problems, and having the correlation between what's shown on the X-ray or the MRI, in other words, the actual pathological tissue damage that's happened, or bone damage in an osteoarthritis situation, and what the level of pain is for that client. There's again not as strong a correlation as you would think between what the tissue damage says and what the pain experience is.
And we see that a lot because I have a lot of clients who come in with a specific MRI. And if I just read the MRI, I didn't meet the person, and I just read it, I might think, oh my gosh, am I going to see someone in a wheelchair? Great example is someone related to you. When I saw his MRI, I thought, oh my. And yet this is someone who cycles, multiple times a week. 50 to 100 miler is not a big deal to this guy. And I'm thinking, how is it possible for all this supposed tissue damage on the MRI that's seen? How can someone function with all of this? And yet we'll have someone else who comes in and I look at the MRI and the word is unremarkable. It's like, all right, you got what every 60-year-old person has, and it's not that big a deal, but you're in agony all the time. So it really doesn't always correlate with what we're reading.
No, I mean, really not. And so this gets to this point of what causes pain to occur for a person, right? When is a person in pain? What does pain mean? How does the body modulate pain? How does it control pain? What is that like? What is that process? So I'm going to use one other little example here. So I talked about being contextual. I used a rather dramatic example for a context. But another way to think about that context more simply is, let's say you are running across the street and a bus I'm thinking of London. So I've got a giant two-story, double-decker bus coming down at me. I'm running, oh my gosh, I've got to get out of the way of this bus. Again, first priority is get out of the way of the bus. In the process of running across the street, let's say I sprain my ankle, right? I just roll my ankle. I'm not going to think about my rolled ankle. It is not going to hurt at that moment.
Right.
It might hurt later. But at that moment, I don't care about my ankle. I'm going to just keep running across the street and figure that pain out later.
Yep.
Whereas if I'm just walking along in, let's say my nice pair of high heel platform shoes, and I roll my ankle, that's going to be my top priority at that time.
Right.
Right. Oh my gosh, I just sprained my ankle. What am I going to do about it? It hurts, blah, blah, blah. So pain is contextual in that sense as well. But the brain makes priorities. What is the most important thing I have to do right now to stay safe as a human?
And this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense because you hear about people who are in shock when they've had an injury which is pretty severe. I can give you an example for myself. I fell out of a mango tree when I was 12 years old and had an open compound fracture where my arm literally was at an angle that it's not supposed to be, and my uh, arm bones, basically the ulna and radius, were sticking out through the skin. And
Oof.
I felt nothing. I was in such shock, and we had to go across this. I'm in Hawaii. We had to go across the island to go to the hospital, and the whole way there, there's no blood. It's really a weird situation. I'm staring at it, and it feels like it's not even part of my body at this moment. So I know I'm in such shock, and never gave me pain meds. Never worried about any of that. So it was very interesting that, again, you just sort of have to get through that moment,
Yeah.
just to survive.
Yeah.
So interesting that, your body does sort of take that priority of what's it going to take for me just to survive this moment. And then we can deal with whatever it is.
Very much so. One other little example I use, and I read about this a long time ago. Um, Again, a lot of this happens within the brain. The brain will change its chemistry based on the sensations that come into it. And one example of this is soldiers in this is the Iran-Iraq War a long time ago, um, would get blown up, right? They'd get blown up, they'd lose a limb. And one of the things they learned early on in basically battlefield medicine was if they could get that person who'd lost a limb or part of a limb, if they could get them somewhere where they could put a nerve block on the primary nerves from that limb as soon as possible after the injury, um, they would decrease the likelihood of post-traumatic stress and decrease the likelihood of phantom limb.
Really?
So there was something about, and their theory, and I think it turned out to be true when they did a bunch of research on it. What happened was the pain signals from the lost limb essentially rewired the brain to continue to experience pain. Like it literally rewired the neurotransmitters and the receptors and stuff so that the brain continued to experience pain long after the limb was gone and things were if it wasn't if those nerves weren't blocked within I think 3 hours or 4 hours or
Oh,
something
so
like that.
really immediate.
Really immediate, yeah. So I mean, a lot of this was for a lot of those guys, they would take them from the battlefield to Germany, which is where the hospitals were for a lot of those guys. And so they would try to do that as quickly as possible. Basically, put them on a chopper and send them off to Germany. And that was also interesting that it's like it wasn't the tissue damage specifically. It was the brain's response to the tissue damage and the trauma.
Interesting.
So you've worked a lot with clients in chronic pain.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing I'll ask you is the pain always the same?
No, no. And what's interesting is when you were saying this about rewiring the brain is they can make the pain come back just by thinking about it. They're not
Yep.
in pain right now, but if they start
Yep.
thinking about it and focusing on it, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Suddenly they have pain again. And they could just be
Yep.
lying on the bed and doing nothing, just lying there on my mat table, and suddenly they start feeling discomfort leading to pain. And it's sort of like, ooh, what's going on here? What has happened in the brain? Because the brain's basically doing it. It's not the body anymore. And the pain does. It changes from side to side. It changes from here. It changes from there. And when we're dealing with nerves, sometimes it's in the foot. Sometimes it's in the, medial aspect of the knee. Sometimes it's up in the hip. And it continues to change. And that depends on the dermatome, depends on where you're getting some impingement, absolutely. But it still can be very different for different people.
And different at different moments,
Absolutely.
right? Like as you said, and one of the things that I wanted to bring out there was, and this is true of anything in life really, the more you pay attention to something, the more you reinforce that pathway in the brain. And a basic example of this is that you notice what you pay attention to what you notice what you pay attention to. So let's say you're in the market for a new car, right? You're just like, I really want to buy a new car.
Right.
So suddenly, and you're thinking maybe you want to buy a Tesla, okay, just because I have one. Okay, so let's say you want to buy a Tesla. Suddenly, all the cars you see, like your brain is focusing on looking for Teslas, and you will have not noticed them ever before.
Yep.
Or let's say it's a car brand you haven't heard of, and you're suddenly looking for like, oh, I think I'm really interested in that new car brand, whatever it is, and suddenly that's all you see.
That's every other car.
Right. Suddenly, like that's because that's what you're focused on. You never would have noticed it before.
Yep.
And pain is very much the same way. Again, if you focus on it and you're like, oh, I'm in pain, 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 that reinforces that pathway in the brain that says, I'm experiencing pain. And you'll see this in clients' behavior. Like I've got clients, I can think of several, who, I'm trying to think of, there's one gal particularly. So essentially, everything caused pain.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. It was never different. It was never better. Everything was always the same. It was just unrelenting. And she kind of couldn't acknowledge that, she could sleep and wouldn't feel it or other kinds of things. And I'd also would see her say like, oh, well, everything hurts, especially when I do this. And then I'd see her do that repeatedly, to lean over and put her shoes on, lean over and put her purse, get her purse. So there was this disconnect from my observation between what she said and what she said her experience was and how she acted.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a client I'm thinking about right now who, it's funny, she's a talker. We all have clients who are talkers. She'll say how much agony she's in. She'll lie down to do an exercise and how much agony, it hurts so much. And then let me tell you about my day. And I'm making her do exercises, but as long as her mouth is moving, she doesn't complain about anything else. And it's kind of funny that I can just sort of bypass that. But as soon as she stops talking, oh, this is killing me. This is killing me. Like, wait a minute. You just did 14 repetitions talking, no complaints whatsoever, and then suddenly you have nothing else to say, and now all I can think about is how much this hurts. So it's interesting that you say that, that focus is very different at that moment.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and and then you've also got other clients, and I've had several at the other end of the spectrum who are, oftentimes, like I think about my brother a little bit with the bad MRI situation we talked about earlier. But a lot of my athletes and my dancers and stuff who are really in what most people consider a lot of pain a lot of the time.
Right.
Right? Like something's going on that's really kind of major. And they just deal. It's not their priority. So the pain is not something that is changing their behavior, stopping them from doing stuff, anything like that. It's just, there's some pain. It's like low level in terms of their priority in their brain.
Yep.
And they're just carrying on.
It's almost background noise.
It becomes background noise, yeah. And they say, like dancers and professional football players have the highest pain tolerances on the planet. So what is pain tolerance?
I wanted to get in
that ability to just keep working.
Yeah, because I mentioned that when I work with mentees, basically, let's call them interns and whatnot, and I try to explain, we'll never know what true level of pain the person who is in front of us is in. Because I had one client that I'm thinking of very specifically who didn't take anesthesia before getting like a root canal. Just didn't need it. Her pain tolerance was through the roof. So when she would say that she was at a level 1.5 to 2, I had to take that really seriously because that meant that it was probably a 5 to 6 on everybody else's scale, maybe higher.
Yeah.
And other people that you just know, it's an 8, it's a 9, and then they'll do exercise and talk and all this kind of stuff. And I did gardening and all of this, and I'm thinking, you did what? At a level 8? I know I've been hospitalized and told them that I was at a level 8. I don't know about you, but man, so everybody has that different level of where their pain tolerance is and what they perceive their pain to be.
And this gets us to two things. The first thing is those pain numbers, as I understand it, were basically developed by the oxy people, by the painkiller people, to sell more painkillers. So,
That doesn't
I mean,
surprise me.
that maybe, no, that may be slightly controversial, but it's like the pain scale, that whole thing.
Yeah.
Two things about that. One, if the first thing you ask a client is, how is your pain today? What does that do? That brings their focus to the pain,
Yep.
right? And not to something else. So using your example, we're often trying to say, okay, so um, your pain is your pain, whatever it is. And you, again, as you so adroitly put it, you have no idea what's really going on inside them, right? It's their
Yep.
experience. They can explain it to you and you have no idea what that really means. So very often, this is where I use this phrase a lot. I look at what they say. I pay a lot more attention to what they do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they can say, as you said, I'm an 8, I'm in this, but they just had their grandkids for the whole weekend. They just went for a long walk. They played tennis on Tuesday. Okay, that is not from my judgment, and this is my judgment. That's not an 8.
Right.
Right? For me, an 8 is limiting your functional abilities to live your life.
Yes.
I can't sit for more than 2 hours. I can't drive to work. I can't sit at my computer. I can't get my wet laundry out of the washing machine. That might be an 8,
Right.
right? I can't get out of bed. So a lot of it is looking at like not what they say, not the numbers, but what can they do? And so a lot of the discussion in terms of working with a client in chronic pain is really focusing not on the pain, but on their function.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than what's your pain level today, it's like, how do you feel today? Just as a general thing. Were you
Yep.
able to bend down and put on your shoes today? Were you able to get it? How was it getting in and out of the car today? So it's more like it's really focusing on what they can do and what the functional capabilities are rather than the pain itself.
Yeah. I learned a long time ago in my practice, I don't ask about the pain. I always just say, how you doing today? And leave it at that. Because you do know the client who immediately is going to, oh, I have this and that, and they're going to get into that. And other clients who are going to be like, oh, had a good weekend. Yeah, we did this. Okay. Never mentioned pain. So I'm not going to bring it up unless they do. And they may be
Yeah.
someone with a herniated disc or, have been told, oh, you're going to need a fusion or whatever. But they've been able to still function in life and function at a relatively high level. So they're not really thinking of surgery at this point. And it just becomes, like we said, a little bit of, or a lot of bit of background noise. But like you say, focus on what they can do, not what they can't do. And sometimes you can change that mindset a little bit. And I find that
Yeah.
fascinating. The client that complains about everything, every now and then I have to remind her, do you remember where you were 3 years ago? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm the exact same. I said, no, you couldn't even lift your leg one time. You couldn't stand anybody even trying to do a hamstring stretch with you. You couldn't do a side lying leg raise to save your life. And then they'll be like, oh, really? I said, you couldn't walk up 3 steps. Oh yeah. I said, now you're walking up and down stairs all the time. Think about what you can do and what you've accomplished rather than what's all the limitations are. And that can definitely change their mindset.
Well, it's one option, right? I mean, so getting back to the science a little bit here anyway. Um, the brain fundamentally controls our pain response.
Mm-hmm.
So, we cut ourselves, the nociceptive signaling goes up through the nervous system up to the brain. Now, it has some places it can get on or off the on-ramp, basically. So let's say it's, you put your hand down on a hot stove, right? your body has reflexes that just go yikes, and that doesn't even get to the brain necessarily. That happens in the spinal cord level, just automatic reflex, like get your hand off the stove, we're done here. And so a lot of stuff is taken care of at that level, just at the spinal cord level. Like, does this? I think of it as like the executive assistant at the gate, right? The information comes in. Does that information really need to go up to the boss up in the brain or not?
Gotcha.
And if it does, yes. If not, then they just, okay, deal with whatever they need to do, move the body or change the muscle tension or whatever they're doing. When it gets past that and is more serious, then it goes up to the brain, and then the brain processes it relative to everything else that's going on. So that's again where context is king.
Prioritizing the moment.
Prioritizing. Yep. And this gets to this kind of bigger concept of pain being a bio-psycho-social phenomenon. Okay, so bio in the sense of there's definitely brain chemistry happening, there's definitely nerve signaling happening up to the brain, to the spinal cord, etc. There's tissue damage that happens that has certain responses. So that's all happening. Psycho, then the brain, what does the brain do with that? And that's where the brain makes a decision on, is this a top priority at this time, or is there something else I really need to be focusing on? And to use some of the examples you used, those, it's interesting that it gets us actually into the social bit, because you think about your client who, when they're not talking about their life, when they're not engaged in social activity, basically, they're in a lot of pain.
Yep.
Right? Oh my God, as soon as they stop talking about whatever they're talking about, they hurt. But when they're talking about it, maybe they hurt, but that's not their priority. Right? So as long as they're engaged in a social situation, they're not in pain. Which leads to something that, certainly any of us who've worked with chronic pain have dealt with, especially in some of the disability circumstances and things like that, is there a social good in being in pain for that person? So I'm going to use an example, which I'll just throw out there. I had a client who, this is complex, so I'll talk through a little piece of this, had excruciating back and basically SI, hip joint pain for years. Nothing showed up on MRI, nothing showed up on X-ray. There was no obvious trauma to the area or tissue damage, but she literally could barely walk, could barely get out of bed, excruciating pain. And she was married, and her husband basically took care of everything, all the shopping, all the cooking, all the cleaning, and made all the money. And it was interesting because two things happened. One, working with a therapist, she uncovered the fact that when she was a teenager, in her late teenage years, her sibling had like kind of leukemia, I think some kind of cancer. And so they needed a bone marrow donor. And she turned out to be the bone marrow donor match. So when you take bone marrow out of the ileum, which is what they were doing, you're under anesthesia, and they basically stab this giant needle into your ileum several times and suck out the bone marrow, which can be apparently really, really stunningly painful and kind of traumatizing, but you're under anesthesia. And there is something about pain that is experienced under anesthesia that I think is weirder than other kinds of pain. And I can't explain that beyond the fact that I've seen that a few times. And so once she uncovered that, she realized that she felt like she had been essentially, used or abused in her case to take care of her sister. And that was the beginning of changing things for her. And this was probably 15 years after the experience.
Wow.
The second thing that happened was she got a divorce. Her husband left her. And again, suddenly, she had to figure out how to do stuff for herself. And she did. So again, don't take that as pejorative, guys, if you're listening to this, but this is part of what pain does. It's like pain is, again, it's physical, it's psychological, and then there's a social component of, is this benefiting me?
Yes.
And all of that, don't get me wrong in here. This does not mean that you can just say, I don't need to feel pain, I can stop having pain now. That's not, if it was that simple, none of us would ever be in pain. It is not that simple. All right. Very little of the brain is under our conscious control. Very, very, very little of it. Most of it is automatic. Most of it is happening at a level that we do not have control over. And that's where a lot of the pain stuff happens.
What's interesting in what you just said, I just jotted down identity, feedback, and attention. I had a
Mm-hmm.
client who, and this was brought up to me by their significant other, who actually decided to leave him because his identity, everything about him, was about his knee. He had
Mm-hmm.
had a replacement that didn't take, got infected. So they had to remove it. He was without a knee for multiple weeks as they took care of the infection. And I saw him 3 or 4 years later, and his knee was the bane of his existence. It was always killing him. And working with us for about 6 months or so, we really got that under control. He had almost zero pain in his knee. But what his significant other said is every single person that they saw, the first question out of their mouth was, "How's your knee?" He got something socially, he got feedback, and he got attention because of it. I've also dealt with, like you, significant others who are in chronic pain, always in pain, but when they're not in pain, they don't get attention from their spouse. So they're getting that positive feedback, even though they need to experience something so negative inside of them, but it's giving them something in their relationship that was missing otherwise.
This is like this is where again where the psychology comes into play so
Yeah.
strongly. And I was thinking about again some friends of mine, and I've watched. I don't have kids myself, but I've watched a lot of people raise their kids, so I have that mildly objective outside eye. And I was watching one group of friends of mine, and the kids tend to be kind of like there's always something going on. They're a little fussy, and for those kids, when I watched their mom respond to them, literally, they would fall down, and the mom, oh my God, would like run over, grab them, pick them up, give them, what can I do? Are you okay? Like a lot of attention for that. And that's one way to do it.
Yep.
Then I was watching another friend of mine who actually is sort of a dad who's mostly raising his kids. And, and it was so different. Like the kid would fall down, and without any of that emotional drama, would just kind of look at the kid and say, "You okay?" And the kid would kind of like you can see the kid kind of looking at him like, should I cry? Kids do that. Should I not cry? Like like, mm, not worth it. Okay, I'm fine, and would carry on. And it was so interesting to watch that conditioning happening, really literally from like a year and a half to 3.
I did that
Just
with
it
my
was just
boys.
fascinating.
I taught them ta-da. If they fell down, as soon as they did it, I'd go, ta-da, and I'd put my hands up. And I kid you not, until they were 3 or 4 years old, every time they fell down, they'd hop right up and do a little ta-da and then move on with it. And people thought it was very funny. And, you'd see them to happen at the park. And I was like, look, if you don't make a big deal of it, it may not be a big deal. If they do cry, then it's a big deal. But you can get past that to a certain degree. And it was very funny to watch them pick this up. So it's interesting that you
I
bring
love
that,
it.
up.
I mean, that's again, that's that piece of pain in context. It was like if you're rewarded for it,
Yeah.
because you are. I mean, attention for all of us really as humans, but particularly as kids, attention is reward, period.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if it's good attention or bad attention. Attention is reward, period. Like
Yep.
that's how we're wired. So if you're rewarded for like, crying and having a big fit, then you know that that's a good thing to cry and have a big fit because everybody will give you attention.
Yep.
If you don't get much attention for it, or you get like that moment of ta-da, or in this other case, like, you okay? Okay, let's carry on. It really changes your relationship to actually really to your physical body and to how you experience pain growing up. I think it gives you a more nuanced view of is this pain a problem, or is it like, yeah, I'm okay, yeah, it hurts a little bit, but not a problem, and I can carry on. And I think learning that early or not learning that early is really critical.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that whole attention aspect of it. Really, I do see that with parents, especially the helicopter parents that so many, including myself, have sort of become, as we grow older. And you and I know that when we grew up, it was none of that. You fell
Yeah.
down, you skinned your knee. I was talking with my son. I said, you do realize that when I was young, I had chronically skinned knees almost all year long. It was one of those things that because I was thinking about it, thinking about scabbing and, all that kind of stuff. And I was like, y'all have never done that. Wow. I went through so many pairs of jeans in the knees because I was constantly crashing my bike and doing things like that, thinking, just a different environment now.
I literally remember the first period of time when I didn't have scabs on my knees. I literally remember like, wow, like my knees are actually just skin. I literally remember that
Yeah,
because I was also, I was a tree climber and a bike, and a bike rider and a runner arounder and constantly falling down and just doing whatever. And I literally remember going, wow, look, it's just skin.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. I wanted to ask you, sort of taking this into more of a therapeutic aspect, just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up today is probably, I don't know, about a month or two ago, maybe it was a little longer. I read an article that talked about inflammation and treating inflammation.
Hmm.
Because again, I deal a lot with the low back. I've got issues myself, that I'm fighting with all the time. So when it came to inflammation, I started reading this and they said that taking anti-inflammatories, especially people who take them chronically, people who are on them for years and years and years, those people almost never heal because the inflammation process actually helps the body to heal. And if you're constantly sort of having that inflammation and tamping it down and having it and tamping it down, is not really allowing it to run its full course. And
Mm.
so I was thinking, what other, and I remember bringing it up to you and you said, oh yeah, that's just one more thing that we can knock off of the whole, how we treat pain because even, rest, ice, compression, elevation, that's been thrown out. And I said, wait, what? So I wanted to sort of ask you about that from all the new data that's come out. What do you, what's your take on it and what have you, discovered?
Well, I think I take a little bit of a moderate view on a lot of these things because I think a lot of things in moderation are
Oh
helpful.
yeah.
I mean, I know for me, having sprained my ankles a million times, that if I do ice it for the first 24 hours, not for the rest of my life, and I wrap it up, that I'm going to get better a little bit quicker.
Mm-hmm.
If I just let that swelling stay, it tends to be more stubborn,
Mm-hmm.
right? So rest ice compression elevation for like an ankle sprain, I found to be pretty useful
Sure.
in the short term, right? You're taking a couple of anti-inflammatories, and you really had a hard workout, you're really sore, you just know things. You maybe done a little more, maybe your knee's a little funky, and just cutting that down, that will often do calm things down.
Mm-hmm.
But the body does generally want to heal. And again, I've seen clients where they need to go through the process of inflammation to heal. I've also seen clients where chronic inflammation really is the issue.
Yeah.
And I don't think that anti-inflammatories are necessarily the answer. It's often, dietary issues or other kinds of metabolic issues that may be going on along with it, that are, outside the scope of this conversation for sure. Um, but I certainly, well, I think everybody says that medication for pain control is a very mixed bag if we're talking about just the medication side of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When it comes to anti-inflammatories, I agree with you in that sense that during an acute stage, part of it is you just need to get the inflammation down because, I was told this by a physician once that their job, their primary job a lot of times, especially orthopedists, is to get the inflammation down first and foremost because infection and
Mm-hmm.
inflammation can, be the detriment of a lot of issues. So to get the inflammation down is huge. And a lot of times that's when, medication comes into play. But we also know the person who's been on Mobic or Celebrex for the past
Yeah,
14 years.
10 years. Yeah, yeah,
And, they don't even realize. And I ask them, is it helping? And they can't tell me because they don't know.
Yeah.
It's not until they get
Yeah.
off of it for one reason or another that they say, oh, yeah, that was really helping. And I think, oh, okay. Was it blocking something that should have been there or not? I don't know. And I sort of in my brain think, is it becoming a crutch? Almost like the person who every time they go skiing still wears that knee brace that they got when they were 16 and they're 46 now. And to me, it's like, look, if that makes you a little more aware of it and you feel safer, hey, more power to you. It's not going to hurt you, I don't think, necessarily. But do you need it? I have you doing
Right.
one-legged squats in here and you're jumping and you're doing all these things and you're totally strong. There's
Yeah.
nothing physically wrong with the knee anymore. It's been too many years. You've completely healed, but they still have that sort of crutch in their mind that they need to.
Yeah, the anti-inflammatory thing is interesting. Um, and that what do you really need? Like what situation you in? And that gets back to that idea of again the psychology and also function,
Mm-hmm.
right? And helping clients to understand like, oh no, I am functional in these ways. That's my goal. That's where I'm headed. Making those goals relevant so that the client knows like, yeah, I want to get better to do this, or I want to be able to do this. Um, the chronic anti-inflammatory thing, I mean, there is evidence, at least studies that I've read, that anti-inflammatories are more effective at dealing with pain than painkillers, than
Mm-hmm.
opioids, for example,
Sure.
because they actually are dealing with the situation, not just the brain, not just basically telling the brain to be quiet about the pain.
Yep.
Um, Interesting.
So it was just one of those things, and
Yeah.
I'm going to put this as a blanket statement for every time we talk about studies. You and I both know that we can get a stack of studies that say one thing and another stack of studies that say the exact opposite, and you
Yeah.
can interpret the data. And I hate to say that a lot of people, when they are doing studies, if they have a bias that they're looking to prove something because they have a financial benefit one way or the other, you can always gear and steer the data one way or another. And I think that sometimes that does happen. And a lot of times when we're reading things in even some of the best newspapers, the person who read the article is now trying to, forgive the term, but dumb it down for general consumption.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes it loses translation. So just be aware when we're saying studies, I try and go back and read the original study. But again, if it's only a single one, a lot more needs to be done in the future in order to really prove one way or the other. I just didn't know if you would come across any other things when it comes to, anti-inflammatories or, icing something. I know people who chronically ice their knees, chronically ice their back. And is it a crutch or is it something that they really need and that can help? It's not from a tough workout or a hike. It's just every day I go home and I ice my knee, and I have for the last 5 years.
I think the science would tell us that that's not very that isn't going to help you necessarily, right? Long term. I think the science is fairly clear that icing every day at some point is really not useful. And again, in an acute situation, which is where, rice is most useful,
Right,
an acute meaning like 1 to 2 days,
right.
not 5 to 6 years, just to get the initial inflammatory response a little bit under control so it doesn't become chronic, or get out of control, which sometimes it can. Um, I think those are things to think about. Again, but to use the knee brace issue you're talking about, the other thing too is every client creates their own ways of feeling safe
Right.
or ways of managing their situation.
Yep.
Maybe it's that I, use a heel lift. Maybe I use a back support. Maybe I have my ergonomic situation at work set up in a specific way so that my back doesn't hurt. Maybe I wear a knee brace. Maybe I have special shoes, right? They've all got, I mean, many of my pain clients have ways of managing that,
Absolutely.
through physical modifications, through, medication, through icing. So from a psychological perspective, that's doing two things. I mean, you can think about it two ways. One, it is reminding them every day that they're in pain, that they are broken,
Yeah.
right? Which isn't necessarily a good thing. Um, but it's also their way of saying I'm taking care of myself. So yes, there's the science of it, which says maybe not so useful, maybe not really doing anything helpful at the moment. And then there's the other side of it, which says psychologically that may be a useful crutch for them to manage their situation.
I think also there's something to be said for becoming aware of the fact that it may have been injured in the past, and maybe just make sure you don't do anything dumb, to that area. Like I say, the skier with the knee brace or something like that. If it just draws a little bit of protection for them, I don't see any harm in that. And maybe a little awareness. As long as they're not thinking, like you said, that I'm broken. It's just, oh, when I wear this, I don't hurt myself when I'm skiing, so I'm going to wear
Mm-hmm.
this. And then it's like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, go for it. If it makes you feel better, feel free, you know?
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, this is a funny analogy, but you think about an animal, or you think about a dog or a cat, like a dog. I'm thinking about my dog particularly. Um, they get an injury. And my feeling is that as soon as that injury is healed, they have forgotten about it.
Yep.
It literally goes out of their consciousness. Humans have these ridiculously long memories. You think about the Hatfields and McCoys. You think about, like these. We have these literally 3,000-year-old conflicts that still live in our memories. And I often think that our bodies are a lot like that. That our bodies have an ability, and our brains have an ability to remember a circumstance. And every time we remember that circumstance, we reinforce it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like we remember how much it hurt to do X. And remember that car accident. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I'm talking to a client about like, how they got the injury or whatever, you'll see them go into this mode of telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I often feel like they are reactivating that entire chain of experience within their nervous system every time they tell that story.
Yep. Yep.
You kind of see that. And other clients who will tell the story, it's like, oh yeah, I da 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 da. And you can tell they're not reliving that story. They're telling it to you, but they're distanced from it. It's
They're
like
not
it's over
invested in it.
there. No, and other clients are like, this is my story. Like what you said about the guy with the knee thing. Um, and that's also that, how psychologically attached are they to the situation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you use the term their story. I find that a lot of people, when they come to see me, the first thing that I do with my assessments is we go through a medical history.
Right.
And I can always tell the person who has either been blown off by physicians or something has happened that before I've asked them a single question, because usually it's like, okay, let's age, height, weight.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just asking general things. They want to launch into their story because they need to make sure that they get it out right away so you understand what's gone on. And I'm like, chill. When we get to that, don't worry about it. We got tons of time. We've got an hour. Let's cover, in my opinion, bigger things. Do you have a heart condition? Have you had a
Right.
heart attack?
Something I need to know.
Yeah, some of those things instead of just talking about your knee or your back. So yeah, they do sort of invest a lot in their story. And as you've told me before, you are not your story. That's what we have to remind our clients. They are not the story. They can move beyond that.
And I think the key thing about modern pain science, because there's all this stuff, which is true and part of it, but the other thing is then how do we bring that into action with our clients?
Yes.
How do we help our clients to move through their pain instead of getting stuck in their
Mm-hmm.
pain? And the advice is simple, um, but not always easy to implement and not always easy to develop be effective,
Sure.
honestly, right? So some of it is not focusing on the pain, focusing on function.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of step one. Um, Not always reinforcing how do you feel, how do you feel, how do you feel, what's your pain like today, not how do you
Right.
feel, but what's your pain like today. Empowering them to really understand what's happening. So education can be really, really helpful in the pain process. Um, in terms of just a client, because a lot of times a client comes in, they're just like, my back's hurt for like 15 years. I have no idea why. And, it's a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
So I have no control over it. So education, help them understand that, like, think about a knee and you think about strengthening the VMO and releasing the lateral,
Mm-hmm.
the lateral leg for patellar tracking, for example. Like, explain to them why that's happening, what they're doing, why they're doing it. And you get buy-in and they go, oh, that means I have some control over this. I can do something about this.
That is
You know?
so important. I have a client right now who, if I just listed all the problems, we'd spend the next hour talking about her. But I have taught her specific things that she can do. And even one of our first sessions taught her pinwheel and telescope arms just to get her to open up through her shoulders a little bit. And she said, oh my gosh, I feel like I can actually do something. It gave her something that she felt she could be responsible to get herself out of pain. And it was the first time that anybody had sort of given her that permission. And she immediately, and even now she writes to me every week and tells me what's gone on for the week. But she'll say, and these 2 days I had zero pain. And when I felt it coming on, I reminded myself, let it go. And I did my exercises. And it gave her that responsibility. It put it off of me trying to always, fix her. And I hate when people use that term, but to put it on her, what can you do to help
Yeah.
yourself out of that situation?
Yep.
And it's worked wonders.
That is a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Because that's really what we're trying to do. Because if they're empowered, if they have some sense of control over what's happening, if they have some tools to change their situation,
Mm-hmm.
if they have a feeling of success in movement,
Yes.
right, which our environments really can provide them these opportunities to, like, oh no, look, you can do this, you can do that. Fantastic. I love that. That's exactly what we're looking for.
Yep. And it is all about movement. And part of it
Yes.
was with her world got very small, because of
Mm-hmm.
pain made it very small. She felt like she couldn't move. So for
Mm-hmm.
her to
Yeah.
realize that she was doing a big movement, we both know telescope arms, pinwheel, you're lying on your side and you're really opening the shoulder. You're really doing a lot of thoracic rotation and stretching out the back. There's so much going on. It's a big movement. And she said, but it feels so good. And just tying in movement and feels
Yes.
good in the same
Yep.
sentence was huge for
Yep.
her.
Yep.
She realized I can move and that it made me feel good. And I was like, yes, yeah. You want to dance around the room when someone does like, yes, you got it. It took hold. And each time she'll bring something else up and she goes, oh, well, I need my combination now, almost like a combination lock for this issue. It's like, all right,
Yeah.
let's talk about what we can do with that and how we can,
Fabulous.
create those. Something that I came up with years ago when it comes to pain and with a client, I don't know where this came from, but it did because he kept bringing up pain, pain, pain. And I said, you know what? I want you from now on to think about this pain because it would come back recurring. You ever had an uncle that comes to visit that you really can't stand? And it comes to visit and stays for, a few days and then goes away again? Well, this is Uncle Frank. And Uncle Frank's come to visit. And you can see them go, what? I say that. Every time this comes back, just say, oh, Frank's back. And the dissociation of me being in pain to something like that in their brain, I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, I don't know why, but that works. Because it's just like they can put it on the shelf. It's like, dang it, Frank's back. Okay. But they can move on with their day because it doesn't become their story anymore. It's just something that's happened. All right, he's here to visit. He'll be around for a little while, then he'll be gone again. And knowing he'll be gone again does help. Knowing that.
I love it. It's dissociating because pain can be extremely overwhelming.
Yes.
I mean, I've had just a couple moments in my life where the pain was so overwhelming that there was literally no getting away from it.
Hmm.
It was my entire world. Like that was all I could experience at that
Yes.
time. Fortunately, it didn't last for long, but it was like, wow, this is everything. And I know I learned a long time ago to try to do that separation. Like this is just pain. It's over there. It is what it is, but it's not me. That identification with it. And I think you've done a really nice job of expressing how to help them to not identify with the pain. I am not my pain.
Yep.
I have pain. I am uncomfortable right now. This hurts, but that's not me.
Yep. And I think part of maybe where I came up with that idea was when I'd hear women talk about their time of the month and they'd have a word
Right.
for it. They'd have a term or something like that. And the way they said it was very, other women knew exactly what they were talking about, but, you know, I didn't. I had to ask,
Right.
what you talking about?
What are you
And
talking
when they
about?
said it, I was like, oh. And it's one of those things, it's just, it's recurring, it happens. And I thought, oh, I wonder if we can do that with low back pain or with knee pain or with
Nice.
whatever.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it really did seem to do the trick for a lot of people, not everybody, because some people just don't want to buy in. But those who do, you can see that it really just like, oh, yeah. And I've had people come in because I've called it Frank for years. Someone will come in and go, yeah, Frank's back. And we'll all know exactly what that means. I'm like, all right, well, we'll deal with it.
But you also get to laugh about it,
Exactly.
right? Again, it dissociates you from the identification. It gives it a name and a place, and it's acknowledged. But again, it's not like deeply embodied at
Hmm.
that time. Yeah, nice.
And it's a
Nice. So look,
takeaway that anybody can use.
yeah, yeah, it's easy. And everybody can relate. Everybody's got a relative that they'd rather not see, or a friend who, drives them crazy every time they show up. Everybody's got that.
Exactly. Exactly. Uh, one more thing I wanted to ask you about, because I sort of have my philosophy on this, and I've talked to many doctors, and clients ask this constantly. So I'm sure, someone out there is going to be wanting to know this. Ice or heat? What do you suggest if someone comes to you with that? Like I said, I have my philosophy, and I've talked to many, many doctors who about this, and a lot of them don't know, and they'll just say, "Well, whatever makes it feel better." For me, I've always said this: in an acute state, I find that, especially with the low back, that ice seems to work the best because it gets rid of the inflammation. Okay, whereas heat sometimes increases inflammation. Uh,
Mhm.
And ice doesn't will actually help shrink the nerve a little bit so that there's not that same nerve response, especially if we're talking about low back pain and they might have impingement of some sort. So they may have numbness, tingling, radiating pain down the leg. Whereas ice isn't going to exacerbate that. Whereas sometimes heat, especially in that first 24 hours, heat can actually cause that nerve to become almost more inflamed and the tissues around it to squeeze it even more, that it can cause increased nerve sensation down the leg. So I usually say first 24 to 48 hours, I prefer ice. After that, to get the muscles to relax, heat's not going to get rid of inflammation, but it can get the muscles to relax. How do you, come at it?
Quite similarly, I also use a little bit of what the issue is. So if I know that if there's primarily a soft tissue issue, there's a muscle spasm, there's some like a sprain strain that's a couple days past its initial injury or longer than that. Then that's when I'll often say, ice may be, or sorry, heat may be a better choice for you. Um, Somebody who's older who I know just has like circulation issues. They're always cold. They have their feet they get a lot of cramps, that kind of thing. I'll be less inclined to use ice, simply because it feels like I don't want to decrease the circulation any more than I think it's already being decreased for them, just based on kind of their physical movement capabilities
That
and
makes
how
sense.
active they are. Um, I do find ice in the initial 24 to 48 hours. If there's something like a sprain or a strain, or even an acute anything, that can be pretty helpful. After that, it's really like, okay, does it really make you feel better? Like, check it. And with ice, I'll often say, um, see if it makes you feel better at the time. see how you feel 2 hours, 4 hours later.
Okay.
Because sometimes what I find is people have kind of like a trampoline reaction where it feels temporarily better, but they feel worse later. So
Interesting.
like, whatever happened during that cold thing, all the vasoconstriction, that kind of thing, the bounce back from that was a negative impact.
Hmm.
And that sometimes will get people into an icing cycle because they feel like they get temporary relief, but it actually gets worse once it gets over the icing. So I'll have them check that for a couple of days sometimes and just see, or I'll say, hey, stop icing and see what happens. And so I'll often play with that a bit.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. I never thought about the vasoconstriction aspect of it with older clients because they are the ones who are also most hesitant to use
Yeah,
ice and will
yeah,
always go to heat. 99% of the time they're going to go directly to heat and sort of avoid the cold because it's very uncomfortable.
yeah.
We all know that. Whereas, for our younger clients, a lot of them will put up with it a little bit more. But that's an interesting concept. I hadn't really thought about that.
I also have one, and I know there's a lot of discussion lately for some reason. I was listening to a podcast the other day that was talking about cold immersion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the benefits of like dunking yourself in a cold bath, or you think about all the athletes who you see kind of in a trash can full of ice cubes, right?
Right.
At the end of an event.
Yep.
Um, and that cold shock to the system.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's at a fairly extreme level, but I know I was hiking in southern Utah in the summer, and it was quite warm for several days. And then the last day, we were hiking up the Virgin River, which you're basically in the river hiking for like miles and miles. And the water's cool. It's not super cold, but it was reasonably cool. Man, I had no inflammation whatsoever. Like that cured any issues I was having because there's just little aches and pains.
Wow.
So there certainly is something to be said um, for cold, just managing kind of chronic low level inflammation. But again, I wouldn't do that every day. That was that was an extreme moment based on the situation I was in. So I think, and even reading the research, which I haven't read a lot of, honestly, there's still a lot to be learned
Yeah.
from the heat ice discussion. I would say I'm going to leave that open because I think it depends a lot on the person and how their body reacts to heat and ice.
Interesting. When you mentioned the cold immersion, uh, for me, what's always I have had chronic sprained ankles. One of my ankles, I've sprained it so many times it's not even funny. Just from athletics and doing whatever, or being clumsy, which more often than not is the case. But the first time I tried cold immersion, and for anybody who wants to try this at home, I'm going to tell you how I learned how to do it because the first time I did it was the dumbest thing I'd ever done in my life, and I wasted a whole bag of ice. Because of course I put the bag of ice into a 5 gallon bucket, Home Depot bucket. And then I filled it with water. And, I was hobbling around and then I stuck my leg into the water. I lasted maybe 10 seconds. Maybe. It was beyond a shock to the system. And it wasn't until later that it dawned on me. I said, oh, what's that thing they say about, a frog? You throw him in boiling water, he's going to hop out. But if you raise the temperature slowly, you can, cook them. And I was thinking, huh. So the next time I put just the water and put my foot in it. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cold in and of itself. Okay. Then I added a little ice. Then I added a little ice. As the tolerance took, I got used to it. I added a little bit more until it was pretty cold, but I was used to it. The thing I like about immersion is you also have the hydrostatic pressure pushing in
Yeah,
on it. So you get the
yeah.
compression as well, which is why I think sometimes athletes that are, like you said, in that big, steel bathtub filled with, ice and water, it's not only, the ice, but also the fact that you have that pressure pushing in on you. And again, if you're walking, knee deep or whatever, waist deep in water for a long period of time, you have that, helping you as well. So I think that could always assist.
Yeah, I think one of the docs I used to work with would always do basically alternate, especially for ankles. He was a podiatrist, so particularly for foot stuff, would do alternating hot cold
Okay.
on the feet. So again, have a hot, you basically have a warm bucket. It wasn't really hot, it was just warm, like room temperature, warmer water, and then a cold bucket. And he would go back and forth between the two. Very short time in the cold, a little bit longer time in the hot, and go back and forth 3 or 4 times.
Interesting.
And again, you're talking about increasing just the blood flow in the area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the cold kind of constricts it, and then it heats it up again, and you're just pumping the blood through it. And I think for a lot of things, that's really useful. So that leads to, yes, you can do it through hot and cold. You can also do it through movement,
Right.
right? So a lot of what I find manages a lot of those chronic kind of inflammation things better, or ultimately, is movement, strengthening, stretching, moving, getting circulation going in the area, because that's what's ultimately going to heal the tissues and make them as healthy as possible, and usually helps to keep the swelling down as well. If you can
Mm-hmm.
really get good movement going for long enough to kind of get things stronger and the myofascial tissues in better shape.
And I think both of us have experienced when people don't move because of pain, especially like the shoulder. How many people have had tendonitis that turned into frozen shoulder?
Yeah,
Or, a severely sprained ankle that didn't get body work, didn't get, whatever done on it. And suddenly I'm not going to say frozen up, but suddenly the range of motion of that ankle 6 weeks or 12 weeks down the road is really significantly less than the other. And if they don't move it, they may not get it back for a long period of time.
yeah.
Or, some people, I know a few, my elderly clients have said, oh, yeah, when I was in my 40s, I sprained that ankle and I've never been able to move it the same way. I'm thinking, my gosh, you're in your 70s. That's been 30 years.
Clearly, you didn't do much to take care of that, because that should have been managed a long time ago.
Exactly.
Ankle
And
sprains aren't that complicated.
yeah, and it's not that they're in pain from it. They just don't have that range of
Yeah,
motion. So we do see almost an ankylosing effect where everything is tightening up and movement really can help those tissues begin to heal. Gets help with
yeah,
inflammation, helps with circulation, but stay within a relatively pain-free range of motion, and you can really and see that range of motion begin to increase over time.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we want to have a takeaway of some sort. Now, normally it's pretty easy to have a takeaway because we're talking about a body part. We're talking about, the back or the knee or something like that. But for pain, it's a little bit different. So I'll give you a second to think about it. For me, I'm going to say try the dissociation, try Uncle Frank, or, putting it on the shelf, finding a way to dissociate yourself from the injury, the pain level aspect of it, and see if that can help, not only with yourself, but with your clients that are coming to you, and get them to, again, not be so invested in that story, but say, oh, okay, yeah, so-and-so's back in town. All right. And see if that can help them move past that. So that's going to be my suggestion for the week.
I love it. I think that's a good one. I want to take that and add to that, add a slightly different element to it. And the element is one of the things that I find um, is very important from the clinician perspective, or from the teacher perspective, the educator perspective, the movement professional perspective, when working with somebody in pain, is how you approach them. So this is what you can
Mm.
do internally.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that is really understanding that you are not responsible for their pain, that they're responsible for their pain, that your best role is to, I describe it this way. A client in pain often wants you to get in the boat with them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like really, literally getting in the boat with them. And what I always say is, you want to be on the dock. Like they can be on the boat, like they're floating away, they're having their issue. You want to stay on the dock or on the shore,
Yeah.
because you're the one who's going to maintain the grounding, maintain the possibility for change, um, understand and have empathy for what they're going through, but not believe that that is their essential state. That's not
Mm.
how they're always going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing, is just creating that for you, that separation too, not just them and Uncle Frank, but you, and a feeling of responsibility for this client and their issues. It's like, yes, you're going to do the best you can. You're going to give them the tools you can give them. It's really up to them to make the change and to learn how to manage this.
I
So
love that.
I think that's where I would go with that.
I love that. I had a physical therapist who once told me that, and I think I said, "Oh yeah, this client, that we shared, I guess I did something," and she said, "Stop, stop. You are not responsible for every pain that they have. You know, don't even think about that. If you do it, it's going to drive you nuts, and you're never going to survive. You got to let it go. You're doing your best. They're doing their best, and not everything that you do is what's causing their pain. Dig deeper." And how many of us have had a client who comes to us and says, "Oh, what we did last week hurt so much. I was in so much pain." I said, "Well, we saw each other Monday. When did the pain come on?" "Saturday." "Okay. Chances are it wasn't me. What'd
Right.
you do Friday? What'd you do Saturday?" "Oh, I was gardening, or I was with the kids." Or I was like, "Okay, maybe could that have been it?" Everyone wants to blame, and I get it. Blame game is pretty common in our industry, you know. But yeah, for us not to, I love that idea, for us not to take that responsibility, not to get in the boat with them, and not to be responsible for their pain, because we're not.
No, one of the things that I had to learn early on, and this was after I'd been, really getting in the boat a lot for a long time. Um, Somebody gave me a great image, which I've used all the time since, and it's been really, really helpful. Which is at the end of the day, like I would find myself thinking about clients. I see them all day, and then I would think about them all night, and then I see them all day, and then I think about them all night, and I would really stay connected to them. And I really felt like I had lost my life, like I was just dealing with
Sure.
my clients. And so the image was this, and there's lots of ways to do this, but the image that I had was, so they come in, and I basically, am in interacting with them, and it's like there's connections being made between the two of us. And I would picture them as an old-fashioned telephone switchboard,
Hmm.
right? Like those little plugs, like they're plugging into me with their stories, and
Yeah,
I'm plugging into them with kind of my advice. Well, as soon as they would walk out the door, I would unplug all of those cords.
I like that.
It's like, and they would retract back into them. It's like, this is okay, I've given you what I can give you. This is yours now. Go.
I love that.
Yeah, it was a lovely, the other image that I've used is like take a big pair of scissors. Because sometimes like a client will keep, like they'll just keep thinking about them, all night. You're kind of like, well, what if I did, what if I, and
Yep.
they'll just really, you'll be obsessing about them a bit. And I would just like picture like a big old like an octopus tentacle, and it was stuck to me, and I had to cut it off. And I would just take my scissors and cut that octopus tentacle, and watch it kind of again retract back, and then another tentacle would come up and slap me, and I'd cut that one off. So sometimes I had to get really graphic with the image to try to really just let that person go, because that's really the best thing you can do for them, and that's what we do as movement professionals.
Yep.
We're not manual therapists. We're not intervening.
Mm-hmm.
We're literally giving them the tools to take care of themselves. And I think to really keep that in our minds helps us to not burn out,
Mm-hmm.
and really helps us to be more effective.
I love that. I love that image. That is awesome. I'm gonna start using that, because that it's so distinct. And yes, I can totally see. Okay, unplug. Bye.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah,
just
and they're
let
out the
it
door, and
go.
it's like that's their, they're taking their cords with them. Boom.
I love that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for letting me sort of interview you on this today, because, like I said, you've done a lot of the research on this, and talked to a lot of professionals when it comes to the pain science. And we're all dealing with clients who are in pain in one way, shape, or form. It's kind of rare that I see someone who's not, and it's always a joy to have someone who just wants to get fit. I love that. But at the same time, that's what I chose to do for a living. So thank you
Mm.
very much, for letting us do a little deeper dive. And I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of these over, the course of the next few months and whatnot. But this was awesome.
Good. It always feels like skimming the surface because there's so much to this.
Sure.
So hopefully you've gotten a little, some insights out of this. There's always more that come. And the more that I've explored this, that just the deeper my own insights into it have become. So hopefully that'll be, your experience as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. You can reach us. We're Moving Conversations. You can reach us at Moving Conversations on Instagram. You can also do it at movingconversations@gmail.com. And Nora and I are announcing that we're taking the show on the road. So we're going to be coming hopefully to a town near you. If anybody is interested in hosting an event where we come to your town and do a 2-day, 12-hour workshop, please let us know. You can do that through the email, and we will find a time to make that happen. So thank
Look
you so
forward to seeing you
much.
guys.
Yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully we'll see
yeah.
you live in the future. And we'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.